Okay, so now we talked about the two different ways that you can buy your plants. We're going to actually get into designing your garden and starting off with the things to consider. First thing we want to consider, which we were talking about earlier, is our crop rotation. So this is actually one of the pages from the Deep Roots ebook that Estelle put together. This graphic, she actually borrowed from somebody else though. But this is like the really, if you have all the space and every single plant that you want to grow, it's the perfect ring of how you want to do your crop rotations, because everything uses different nutrients and both macro and micronutrients. But the really big thing I always want to tell you guys about is why you want to crop rotate. The really big reason that we push crop rotation so heavily is because if you have all of your cabbage in one spot one year, the cabbage bugs, whatever bug you might end up with, is going to go and they're going to go lay their eggs on your cabbage from wherever they came from. That is then going to hatch. You're going to have the bug crawl around for a while. Eventually it'll morph, but usually they're going to end up putting their eggs right back in that same area where your cabbage was. They don't move very, very, very far. So the whole idea is that if you take your cabbage from one side of your garden and move it to the other side of your garden, now it's more difficult for them to find your cabbage. And in the meantime, something we'll also talk about later is once I move my cabbage from right here to the other side of my yard, if then I go and cover that cabbage early on in the season when they're out looking for places to lay their eggs, they can't get access to my cabbage either. But if they were in the soil, even if I covered it with something, they could just come right out of the soil and they're already sitting on their house plant. So those are the two of the big things, is nutrition and then helping reduce pest issues, and it also helps with different disease issues. If you have some sort of disease that got your plant really, really bad and then it just died right in place, your really best bet is to actually grab all that plant material and get rid of it. But if you just let it die right in place, all that's going to be sitting there dormant in the soil. Sometimes a really good cold snap can kill it. You guys know this year, our longest cold snap's been about a week. And for some of them, you need a couple of weeks of like below freezing temperatures. So right now we're seeing actually more bugs and diseases that are staying around from year to year. But that's another reason you want to rotate, so that you're not putting the plant that you just had get a disease, catching that same disease in the same spot. Next thing I want to talk about is companion plants. And here we've got a list of companion plants. This is also from the Deep Roots ebook. But as you can see, we've got all the different plants that you want to grow. So let's say you want to grow asparagus. It's going to show you what other plants are good to plant around your asparagus. Same thing, beans is going to be all the legumes. So that's your beans, your peas, your edamame, peanuts, all those. A lot of the legumes, they're going to have a lot of companion plants that are going to like being around it, because the legumes are putting the nitrogen back in the soil, where if you look at like your corn wants to be back in your beans or by your peas, because the corn's a really heavy feeder. But this is a really cool chart that we've been putting together that really shows like who plays really well next to each other. But then the time when companion planting really comes in to use is when we're talking about pests. So a really great example that you'll see a lot of people grow decently often is your marigolds. Marigolds are really, really useful with whitefly. You'll see people will put in chives in their flower beds. Not only are chives something that it is a perennial herb in this zone, but they help a lot with aphids. The really big thing I'm trying to drive home with this is that a lot of these things are pretty. A lot of them you can also eat. Dill, you can eat both the actual leaves as well as the seeds. You've got like oregano is just a straight up herb. Sage, I think that's parsley. But a lot of these things peppermint, I can see right here. Peppermint can help you with your cabbage looper. So if you grow your peppermint around the outside of your cabbage, you're actually helping reduce the impacts or chances of that cabbage looper coming in and decimating your cabbage. So it's another way to work away from any sort of pesticides, and usually having either the side effect of it's also edible, or they usually look awful pretty. So just something to think about. Why I asked earlier if anybody has a flower garden because you can take those same skills and a lot of those same plants actually move them over. Another one that's really fun that's right here that actually Estelle was talking about earlier today, nasturtiums. If you've ever heard of nasturtiums, they actually do very well in the shade or in the sun. The leaves are edible. They're kind of peppery. You can add them into a lettuce. So are the flowers. They're not that peppery, but you can eat the flowers as well. But look at the list on the nasturtium. They help discourage aphids, cabbage looper, cabbage worm, cucumber beetle, whitefly, and squash bug. So that's something that the leaves are edible, the stems are edible, the flowers edible, and it helps keep a lot of bugs away. So just something to think about when you're trying to decide what you want to plant in your garden is including things that will help make your life a little bit easier. Light requirements, we touched on this earlier, but I need to bring it home when we're trying to come up with how we're going to design our garden, is keeping in mind how much light all the plants need as we're designing the actual layout of our garden, which is where we're working to here. Next thing I want to talk about that I've hit on but not just straight up blatantly told you guys is you do not have to sacrifice aesthetics to get the garden that's producing the way you want. Again, we were talking a minute ago about throwing in your marigolds and your lavender and your nasturtiums, and there's really pretty ways to include these flowers into your garden in a way that will both protect your plants that you're trying to grow for their actual harvest and get some beauty out of it at the same time. Plant season length. This is a chart that's actually made by the Homestead Gardener, but right now with Deep Roots, we're trying to make one for you guys that would work even better here in our zone. Because what this isn't showing you is, it doesn't show on the bottom here, but this is when you can start it inside. This is when you can start it outside. Oh no, this is starting outside, and this is transplanting this green. What this is not showing you is how long those specific plants stick around. To help you try to plan your garden out better. So what Estelle and I are working on is, where's a really good example in here? I'm just going to throw one down here in the bottom and add it on myself. If you wanted to grow Brussels sprouts, has anyone ever grown Brussels sprouts before? Okay. Brussels sprouts grow like weird alien plants. If you see them, you would. If you ever bought them in the store still on the stalk? Okay, yeah. So you've seen what it looks like when they're still on the stalk. It grows out looking like it's a cabbage, but it just keeps on getting taller and taller and taller, and then the bottom leaves start to die off, and then on the stalk there's just all those little Brussels sprouts. And they actually can survive all the way into the first couple frosts, and the first couple frosts actually make them taste a little bit sweeter. But what's interesting about Brussels sprouts is this actual timing with tomatoes is pretty similar. You'd start growing them inside and then transplant them outside in late spring. But if you were planting them outside, you'd actually plant them right about here. Well, unlike tomatoes, they're going to be taking up that space in your garden all the way through wintertime. So that's where Estelle and I, like I said, once we get it finished, we'll get it out to everybody. But we're working on a new chart that'll help everybody kind of understand how long things actually take up space in your garden. Another good example is garlic. Here it's showing planting garlic in the fall. But it's not like you just plant it here and it's over. The garlic's actually sitting in the ground. It'll probably pop out some greenery right here before it finally gets cold, but then it'll just be sitting there as leaves until about like here, or here-ish, where you'll actually pull it out of the ground. So wherever you have your garlic, you can't plant anything else until you pull that garlic out. So that's the stuff that we want to help you guys out with. So we're going to pump that chart out. But just like I said, something to keep in mind. Back to your snow peas or snap peas again. With the snap pea situation, you're going to end up with a gap about right here somewhere that you can't grow. There's nothing growing in that space because it'll kill off the snap peas or snow peas when it starts to get really hot. So that's when you make sure that in here somewhere you're throwing in a green bean or something else that'll grow during that time period. Next, we're going to talk about warm and cold season plants. So now we already kind of talked about what plants you can and cannot grow because of the light you have. But next we want to talk about what times of year these different plants can grow. So the first one we're talking about is going to be cold season plants. So we actually have two cold seasons because we're spoiled rotten. So we have the spring and the fall. So a lot of these plants, especially if they have the really good turnaround time on getting to your actual production of your crop, you can plant both in the fall and in the springtime. On this list you can see you got lettuce, spinach, carrots, Swiss chards, beets, radishes, turnips, these Chinese greens, broccoli, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, peas, cauliflower, green onions, leeks, scallions, and then most of your leafy greens. We'll talk about later in this presentation actually how you can get some of this started even earlier, but these are the ones that you're going to be growing in the springtime and then late in the fall. Then we've got our warm season crops. So with our warm season crops, the big idea is we do not want to put these out until after the frost is over. And I guess I actually should explain that with the cool season crops. A lot of them you can plant in the yard, bare seed or even some of the seedlings before the frosts are done. So some of them, I mean, I actually have some of it written down later, but like kale, you can plant kale outside like 6 weeks before the last frost. Just the seedlings. Just the seeds. And if it snows on them a couple of times, if there's a couple of freezes, they'll survive. And with a lot of them, it'll actually increase your germination rates because with these cold season crops, they usually have thicker seed shells. So the cold snaps actually help break down that seed shell so that it's easier for the plant to actually germinate out of the seed. Warm season crops, we're looking at corn, beans, tomatoes, melons, potatoes, summer squash, cucumbers, eggplant, most of your herbs, onions, mustard, squashes, pumpkins, peppers, and sweet potatoes. If you've also noticed, this list is almost the exact same list from full sun plants. And then when you get into the shadier plants, a lot of those are the cool seasons. So what's really, really nice is even if you've got a spot in your yard that's not getting all the sun, and if you really want to save that spot up for these really big plants that need the full sun all the time, you can wait until a little bit later in the year to get them in the ground after you actually get that first harvest out of one of the cool season crops. Another thing we want to keep in mind as we're coming up with our plan is we want to make sure we're utilizing vertical garden space. So whatever that may be, this is actually an old dead tree in my parents' yard that for a very long time we called it the pickle tree because we would grow pickles up it every single year. So if you've got space like that, you got to make sure you're taking advantage of that, whether it's putting up a trellis and growing your vegetables up that trellis and then giving yourself some shade, or if you're just trying to take advantage of sunlight, or having something like we were talking about with celery, having the celery grow up to the sunlight.